train rumbled through the night. The conductor came through the car from time to time, calling out towns. Albany, Utica, Syracuse, like the names of long-lost sons. When Anne got up to find the privy, she found it difficult to walk, the car jostled so. She wondered if there were any other fugitives on board. The car was almost full, with either passengers or piles of luggage taking up every seat. A few children lay sprawled across their mothers' laps, both child and mother asleep. One young mother slept, her head tilted back, with a baby nursing at her breast. There were men in fine suits and men in torn, threadbare coats, all of them bumping from side to side with the motion of the train. Sometimes Anne slept, then awoke with her neck stiff and her back aching. Reverend Freeman sat next to her, sometimes dozing, sometimes looking out the window into the darkness. She'd hardly spoken to him, but he seemed to understand her silence and remained a comforting, quiet presence. It was still dark when the train stopped at yet another town, and the commotion of passengers leaving and getting on awakened both Anne and the Reverend. He caught her eye and smiled. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Anne rubbed her sore neck. "I'm all right," she said. "Are we close to Canada yet?" "Getting there," he answered. Then he pointed out the window. "Look at the mills." The massive brick building stood silent, their rows of tall, dark windows staring into the night like hollow eye sockets. 60 years ago, said the Reverend, slavery was dying out. It looked as if folks were about to come to their senses and end the whole thing. But then the cotton gin came along, and folks up north here realized they could use lots of raw cotton for the mills. The only place to get raw cotton is the South, and the only way to grow it cheaply is with slave labor. Slaves growing cotton in the South meant that mill workers in the North would keep their jobs. So both Northerners and Southerners decided maybe slavery wasn't such a bad thing after all. We got 100 new mills and thousands of new slaves. The train started up again and carried them past the town and its mills into the countryside. In the east, the sky began to turn pink, and the snow took on a rosy glow. "Is it time for breakfast?" Reverend Freeman asked. "It must be," said Anne. He opened the bundle Sarah Tappan had packed for them, slices of cold bacon between thick chunks of bread, apples, and a flask of water. They ate as the sun rose, small and white-yellow. Anne had fallen asleep again by the time the conductor marched through their car and called, "Next stop, Buffalo." She rubbed her eyes and sat up straighter. The Reverend leaned close to Anne. "After Buffalo is Niagara Falls," he said quietly. "Many of the trains don't go across the suspension bridge to Canada, so we may need to get off this one and wait for one that does." It sounded simple enough. "The suspension bridge is the most likely place for slave catchers to be waiting," Reverend Freeman said. Anne's stomach tensed. "This will be our plan," said the Reverend. His voice was calm and reassuring. "We will act as if you are very ill. I will support you as if you barely have the strength to stand. Even a slave hunter will be afraid of catching a bad case of cholera or consumption. Lord willing, we'll be left alone, and a train will come soon to take us over the bridge." This sounded like a good plan. Why shouldn't it work? She'd come too far to be caught now, she decided. She watched the early afternoon sun make the snow glitter with multicolored points of light. At Buffalo, more passengers got off than got on. Anne guessed that not many people went to the small town of Niagara Falls, and even fewer were going across to Canada. "Next stop, Niagara Falls." She gripped the arm of her seat and waited. As the train pulled into the station, passengers gathered their food baskets, coats, and luggage. Reverend Freeman checked the latches on his suitcase. Anne held hers in her lap and hugged it. Outside on the platform, passengers waited, their bags at their feet, their breath freezing in the cold air. Many people wore hats and coats made of fur instead of wool. A white man in an official-looking uniform stepped onto their car. "Papers. I need to see your papers," he said. The passengers rummaged in sacks and pockets, pulling out their documents. One man even ripped the lining out of his coat in order to retrieve his. The Reverend took his freedman's papers from his suitcase, and Anne reached inside her shirt to get hers. The uniformed man read each document carefully, checking to make sure the printed description matched the person. As he read Anne's, he looked from the paper to her and back to the paper again. She knew he was reading a description very similar to the one in her runaway notice. Thick hair, light skin, slender build, freckles. And she knew that the description, combined with the girl's clothes in her suitcase, could easily betray her. She hugged her suitcase more tightly. Then she relaxed her grip as the man handed her documents back to her and moved on to the next passenger. After the man left the car, the train still showed no signs of moving, and no conductor came to announce the next stop. Reverend Freeman rose and began to gather their belongings. "Looks like we'll have to change trains," he said. He fixed his eyes on Anne. "We'll do just as we said." Anne picked up their bundle of food and hoisted her suitcase, but the Reverend reached for it. "I'll take that," he said. "Remember, you're too weak to carry it." She was ready to stumble off the train looking as sickly as she could manage. The fact that her papers had passed inspection gave her confidence, and she'd begun to think that acting ill might be rather interesting. Then she heard the dogs. It was the sound of bloodhounds on a hunt, of nigger dogs in hot pursuit of a runaway. The sound froze them both, and out of the train window they saw a well-dressed man being led away in shackles. Anne's breath caught in her throat. He had made it this far, almost to Canada, and now he would be sent back. She shut her eyes and her mind against what would happen to the man once he was returned to his master. A conductor moved through the car, asking for tickets. When he looked at theirs, he said, "Clear through to Canada, eh?" Reverend Freeman nodded. "Sit down, then. This car goes across." Anne sat down, trembling, and greatly relieved. The bloodhounds used one of two things to find a runaway: the scent from an item of their clothing left behind, or the scent of fear. Dogs were not fooled by well-forged papers or elaborate disguises. Anne felt quite certain that if she'd had to walk by those hounds, they would have smelled her terror. Anne willed the train to start and get her out of this land where innocent people could be beaten and maimed for simply wanting their freedom. Outside her window, she saw the man who had checked her papers talking with the two men holding the hounds. The dogs were restless, pacing to the end of their straps, straining, being yanked back and pacing again. Almost without thinking, Anne reached into the food bundle and pulled out a chunk of bread and bacon. She remembered what seemed like a lifetime ago, running up a hill in the moonlight to feed Master Charles's hounds. It was one of those important things her parents had taught her, like remembering to say "sir" when speaking to one's master, or remembering to keep one's skirt away from the flames in the hearth. Remember to have food in your hand when the hounds are near. She pressed her fingers around the bread and bacon and rested her forehead against the window, wishing those men would leave, or the train would start, or both. She glanced at Reverend Freeman in his seat next to her. He sat silently, his eyes closed and his head bowed. She saw his lips move in prayer. Suddenly it struck her that he was in more danger than she, and her chest went cold. If they were caught, she, at least, would be sent back alive. Would the Reverend Freeman receive his trial and sentence and punishment right here on the cliffs overlooking the Niagara River? She shuddered and touched his hand lightly. As he opened his eyes to look at her, a dog's yowl startled them both. The sound did not come from outside on the platform. It came from behind them, at the end of their car. Anne jumped up to kneel on her seat to see. The three men she'd seen talking together, and the two hounds, had just entered their car. "One more search before we go over the bridge," the man in the uniform said. The hounds yelped and strained at their collars. Two of the small children began to cry. A woman swatted at one of the dogs with an umbrella, and the dog's owner threatened to hit her. "You have checked our papers. Why are you molesting us with these hounds?" Reverend Freeman's voice boomed above the mayhem. "If your papers are real, then you have nothing to worry about now, do you, boy?" the uniformed man snapped. Anne took calm, slow breaths. She blocked the fear out of her mind. If only her own safety had been at stake, she might not have been able to keep the terror at bay. But she must not, would not, be the cause of horrible things happening to Reverend Freeman. The bread felt sweaty in her palm. The dogs moved down the aisle, rowdy and excited, but not yet locked into a scent that said fugitive. Anne wished she could tell Reverend Freeman how important it was to stay calm, but there was no time. The dogs yelped, yanked on their straps, and raced the last few paces to the Reverend's seat, dragging their owners with them. They barked viciously at the Reverend, baring their teeth, their owners barely able to restrain them. "Call your dogs off!" Reverend Freeman held up his hands to protect his face. "Call them off, I say!" "I think we have something here," one of the men said, grinning. With one hand he held his dog back, and with the other he grasped Reverend Freeman's arm. "You're coming with us, boy." He jerked his chin at Anne. "You too. Let's go." Reverend Freeman yanked his arm out of the man's grasp, and at the same moment Anne shot her hand inside the breast of the Reverend's suit. She pretended to fumble around, and when she pulled her hand out, she revealed the bread and bacon. "Uncle," she found herself saying calmly, "why do you always keep your lunch in your coat like that? You're driving those poor dogs crazy." She broke the morsel in two and threw one to each of the dogs. Then she quickly found the rest of their bread and bacon and continued throwing bits to the now well-distracted hounds. "Your dogs seem mighty hungry, sir," she said as amiably as she could muster, tossing the last of the food at the snapping mouths. "They wanted that bacon real bad." The dogs sniffed the floor, the seats, and Reverend Freeman's breast pocket. They pulled to get at Anne to sniff her hands, but they were quiet. They no longer cared about leading their masters to a fugitive and her escort. Their only interest was in more food. The men scratched their heads. "I told you we wasn't feeding them enough," one of the men said, and punched his partner in the arm. I know." The other man rubbed his arm, annoyed. They led the hounds off the car. As they left, Anne heard one of them say, "Stupid nigger, keeping that greasy old bacon right in his coat pocket. They don't know nothing about living like civilized people." Anne and the Reverend looked at each other. She smiled shakily. He took out his handkerchief and mopped his brow with trembling hands. The train gave a rumble and a hiss, and slowly began to move. Anne gasped. "We're going!" she cried. The train picked up speed, and within minutes it left the solid earth. It snaked its way onto the suspension bridge hanging between the States and the free land of Canada. Hundreds of feet below, the emerald green Niagara River wound through the gorge. Here and there on its surface, flecks of white rapids glistened in the sun. On either side stood tall, steep cliffs. Anne watched as the far cliff, the one called Canada, came closer and closer. As the river below disappeared, and the train once again rejoined solid earth, Reverend Freeman reached for her. "Thank God," he cried. He clasped her hands in his. "We are safe in Canada." Chapter 32.